All right, so you're back with us for another deep dive. And this time, well, you've brought something really interesting to the table. Excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, no less. And the topic is toleration. Now, I know you like to go deep, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Not just skim the surface, but really dig into the philosophical meat of it, the history, the different thinkers, the nuances, the whole shebang.
Exactly. I mean, toleration, it's not just some everyday concept, right? It's a cornerstone of political philosophy, and we're going to treat it that way. Unpack all the complexities, all the debates, all the stuff a real philosophy enthusiast wants to grapple with.
So let's get down to brass tacks, the very heart of it, right? As the entry tells us, the word toleration, it comes from the Latin tolerare, meaning to put up with, to countenance, to even suffer. Basically, it's this idea of accepting, or at least not interfering with, something you actually think is wrong. But there's a catch, you still consider it tolerable, meaning you wouldn't go so far as to try and ban it or suppress it. You can already see how this plays out in so many different ways, right?
Absolutely. And that initial judgment that something is wrong or bad, that's key. Without that, you're not talking about toleration anymore. You're in the realm of, I don't know, indifference, maybe even approval. That negative judgment, that's the foundation, the very ground upon which this whole concept of toleration stands.
Right, right. And then going deeper, the entry lays out these three core components of toleration. First up, like you said, the objection component. This is simply the belief that whatever it is you're tolerating, it's wrong in some important way.
And it's fascinating how diverse this objection can be, right? It
Hmm.
can be rooted in morals, religious differences, practical worries about the consequences. The source of the objection itself, that can vary quite a bit.
Second, we have the acceptance component. So you've got this negative judgment, but then there are these positive reasons specific to the situation that outweigh your urge to, step in and stop it. So you hold back, you permit it, you tolerate it. And here's where the philosophy gets really, really interesting.
Because on the surface, it almost looks like a paradox. Like, how can it be morally right to not act against something you believe is morally wrong? The reasons behind this acceptance, that's where the true understanding of the nature and the limits of toleration lies. It's a real insight. Tolerating something morally wrong, it doesn't mean abandoning morality. It needs to be justified by higher-order moral principles.
And finally, we've got the rejection component. Here's where we draw the line. The reasons to reject the belief or practice, they become stronger than the reasons to accept it. This is where toleration stops and intervention becomes necessary.
And it's important to grasp what the entry highlights here. It's not just two zones, the stuff we agree with and the stuff we think is wrong. It's three. The stuff we agree with, the stuff that's wrong but tolerable, and then the stuff that's just plain intolerable. And that means two crucial boundaries. One separating what we're okay with from what we think is wrong but can tolerate, and another boundary separating that from what's just unacceptable, beyond the pale.
Makes you realize how much more nuanced the whole picture is, right? And then the entry stresses something really important. Toleration has to be voluntary. If you're only refraining from interfering because you simply don't have the power to do anything, well, that's not toleration. That's just, enduring, putting up with it. But even if you don't have the power to actually prohibit something, you can still choose a tolerant stance, meaning you wouldn't suppress it even if you could.
It's an internal thing, isn't it? A matter of principle, a commitment to forbearance,
Yeah.
not just passively accepting the situation because your hands are tied.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, but this all leads us to some, well, let's call them philosophical head scratchers. The paradoxes of toleration. The entry introduces three, and the first one is a doozy. The paradox of the tolerant racist. How on earth can someone be considered truly tolerant if they hold racist beliefs?
Yeah, this one really throws the spotlight on that objection component we talked about. Picture this. Someone with deeply racist beliefs, but maybe for strategic reasons, like to avoid getting in trouble or to keep up appearances, they choose not to act on those beliefs. Superficially, they might get labeled tolerant because they're not openly acting out, but the paradox pops up when you ask, can tolerance really be a virtue in this case? It just feels wrong, doesn't it, that an inherently immoral belief could somehow be part of a virtuous character just because there's some self-restraint added on top. To call that tolerance, it feels off. It's a key insight. Real tolerance, virtuous tolerance. It requires the objections themselves to be at least minimally reasonable. It can't just be strategic inaction driven by prejudice.
That's a crucial distinction right there. The entry points out that the mistake is thinking the racist objection is some legitimate ethical point that just needs controlling. Sure, everyone doesn't have to agree on the reasons for objecting, but those reasons, they have to at least be somewhat reasonable. They can't be based on irrational prejudice and hate.
Absolutely. The goal here can't be to just create tolerant racists while the racist beliefs themselves remain. The goal has to be to get rid of those beliefs altogether. This paradox really highlights that toleration isn't always the right answer to deeply immoral views.
All right, paradox number 2. The paradox of moral tolerance. This one seems to revolve around the acceptance component. How can it possibly be morally right to tolerate something that is, by its very nature, morally wrong? Does it sound like a flat-out contradiction?
It does appear that way, doesn't it? A contradiction at first glance. But the way to solve it, the entry suggests, is to differentiate between different types or levels of moral reasons. There have to be these higher-order moral principles, the ones that actually justify and provide the framework for toleration, and also set its boundaries. And these principles, in specific cases, can make it ethical to tolerate certain actions or beliefs that initially you'd say are morally wrong. Think of things like respecting individual autonomy, keeping the peace and stability in society, avoiding even greater harms that might come from suppressing the belief or practice you dislike. These higher-level considerations, they can sometimes outweigh that initial moral objection.
So it becomes a matter of weighing different moral duties against each other. You might have to tolerate a smaller moral wrong to uphold more fundamental moral principles in a given situation.
That's the idea. Toleration, it's not about endorsing everything. It's a conditional acceptance, and it's grounded in a whole hierarchy of moral values and principles.
Paradox number 3, the paradox of drawing the limits. And this one's all about the rejection component. We all know that slogan, right? No toleration for the intolerant. But as the entry points out, that's a slippery slope. Who gets to decide who's intolerant? And isn't drawing that line itself an act of intolerance?
Yeah, this is huge. Critical theorists have really dug into this. If toleration always means setting boundaries against whoever you label intolerant, and if every time you set a boundary it's a bit arbitrary and therefore potentially intolerant itself, then, well, the whole concept of toleration seems to self-destruct.
You're walking a philosophical tightrope there, aren't you?
You are. But the entry proposes a way out. It suggests we need to distinguish between types of intolerance. There's the intolerance of those who reject the whole idea, the norm of toleration itself. They don't think differing beliefs and practices should be allowed, period. And then there's the lack of tolerance that's specifically aimed at that rejection of the norm of toleration. The argument is that for tolerance to work, to be a virtue, a stable practice, it depends on making that distinction. And it depends on us being able to draw justifiable, non-arbitrary lines against those who are actively trying to undermine the very possibility of toleration.
So it's not about having to tolerate absolutely everything, including those ideologies or actions that are specifically designed to dismantle the framework of toleration itself. There have to be principled reasons based on the justification of toleration itself or where we put those limits. Yeah.
Exactly right. And this all emphasizes one vital point. Toleration. It's what's called a normatively dependent concept. It doesn't generate its own reasons for objecting, accepting, rejecting. It has to draw on external, independent, ethical, and political principles to give it substance, to justify it. Toleration itself isn't automatically good, morally speaking. It only becomes a virtue when it's based on solid normative reasons.
Okay, we've explored the concept, we've wrestled with the paradoxes. Now the entry dives into different conceptions of toleration, and it makes clear that these aren't like historical stages in a straight line. They're different ways of understanding and practicing toleration, and they can all exist at the same time, even within the same society or the same person's thinking. First up, we have the permission conception. What's the gist of this one?
The permission conception, it sees toleration as coming from a power dynamic, a hierarchy. You got those in authority, or the majority, and then you've got a dissenting minority. Toleration in this model, it's basically an allowance granted by those in charge to the minority to live and act according to their beliefs. But there's this unspoken condition. The minority accepts that the dominant position is ultimately in control. They don't fundamentally challenge the status quo. It's all about power dynamics, a top-down allowance. That's permission.
So a top-down approach. The minority gets to be different in certain private areas as long as they don't mess with the public political order. And the reasons behind this permission, well, they can be practical. Like maybe keeping the peace is just easier than trying to suppress everyone. Or they can be more principled, acknowledging that forcing people to believe things is just wrong.
Exactly. And this is the conception that Goethe famously criticized. He said, tolerance should only be temporary. It has to lead to recognition. To tolerate is to insult. What he's saying is that permissio negativa mali, just not interfering with something you think is bad, well, it can be really condescending. It doesn't grant real respect.
Conception number 2, the coexistence conception. How's this one different?
Here, the power structure changes. It's less about a strict top-down hierarchy and more about groups that have roughly equal power. They realize that tolerating each other, finding a modus vivendi, a way to live together, it's the best way to avoid conflict and go about their own business. It's compromise, give and take, driven mainly by self-interest and wanting peace. Coexistence is all about compromise between relatively equal groups looking out for themselves.
More transactional, right? I'll tolerate you if you tolerate me. The main goal is avoiding harm, not some deep respect for the other group's values.
Right. But the entry points out that this type of toleration can be really shaky. If the power balance changes, if one group becomes a lot stronger, well, they might not feel like they need to tolerate the weaker group anymore. So the foundation of toleration here, it's this fragile balance of power, not shared principles or mutual respect.
Next, we have the respect conception. This sounds like it goes beyond just allowing or compromising for self-interest.
It definitely does. The respect conception, it's about recognizing each other as moral and political equals, even when there are these fundamental ethical and cultural differences. The idea is that the rules of the game, the social and political framework, should be based on norms that everyone can accept, norms that don't unfairly favor one group or worldview over others. The core of respect. We're all equal, morally and politically, despite our differences.
Okay, so the entry goes on to talk about 2 models within this respect conception: formal equality and qualitative equality. What's the key difference here?
Formal equality. It's all about a strict separation between public and private. Ethical, cultural, religious differences, they belong in the private sphere. They shouldn't cause conflict or lead to different treatment in the political realm. The French secular republican model, with its emphasis on neutrality in public institutions and restrictions on religious symbols in schools, that's a good example of this approach.
So everyone gets treated the same in public, regardless of their personal beliefs and practices in private. That's the idea.
That's the principle.
Mhm.
But the qualitative equality model, it points out that this seemingly neutral separation, it can actually disadvantage some groups, especially those whose beliefs and practices need a more visible public expression than traditional norms allow for.
So the argument is that treating everyone the same formally doesn't always lead to true equality for everyone. It can ignore existing social and cultural power dynamics.
It's exactly. Qualitative equality. It tries to address this by respecting different identities. It considers making adjustments to legal and social structures so that all groups can fully and equally participate in public life. But of course, this is all within the limits of reciprocity and respecting fundamental rights. The goal is real social and political equality while still valuing and respecting cultural differences.
And finally, we have the esteem conception. This sounds like the most demanding form of toleration.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The esteem conception, it's not just about respecting different beliefs and practices. It's about actually having a degree of ethical esteem for those beliefs, seeing them as potentially valuable or at least worthy of positive regard, even if they're really different from your own. The entry talks about reserved esteem, where you accept another person's beliefs in a positive way, even if you don't find them as personally appealing as your own beliefs. Thinkers like Joseph Raz and Michael Sandel, they've explored this idea. Esteem means seeing value in beliefs that are different from your own, even if you don't personally embrace them.
So it's not just putting up with it, not just respecting it, but actually finding some merit or value in perspectives that are different from your own. That takes intercultural understanding to a whole new level.
It does, and it raises the bar for toleration significantly. The entry emphasizes that figuring out which of these conceptions should guide a society, well, it depends on the specific conflicts they're dealing with and on finding solid, normative reasons for their choices in that particular context. The concept of toleration by itself, it doesn't give us those justifications. We have to ground it in broader ethical and political principles.
This brings us to the history of toleration. And it's not a simple story of progress, is it? The entry reminds us that the term tolerantia, back in ancient Stoic philosophy, it mainly meant endurance, bearing hardship, putting up with suffering.
Right, the idea of applying it specifically to religious differences, that starts to emerge in early Christian thought. Thinkers like Tertullian and Cyprianus, they were grappling with how Christians should deal with other religions in a world that was mostly not Christian.
And within Christianity, you see these arguments for toleration developing. Appeals to Christian charity, the idea of separate spiritual and temporal realms. the two kingdoms doctrine, and the inherent limitations of human authority when it comes to faith and conscience.
The entry highlights this crucial principle. Creder non potest nisi volens. Faith can't be forced, it has to be willing. That idea that genuine religious belief requires inner conviction, it became a strong argument against using force in religion, a foundation for arguments in favor of religious toleration.
But then you look at Augustine and you see how even someone who advocated for these ideas could change their mind. When faced with what they saw as threats to religious unity, they argued that coercion, in some cases, could be justified by a higher goal, like saving souls. That's a real tension point in the history of the concept.
It shows how complicated and even contradictory the development of the concept was. The desire to uphold what they saw as the true faith, it often clashed with the principles of toleration. And the entry rightly points out that this wasn't just a Christian debate. Medieval interreligious dialogues, philosophical defenses of truth-seeking in Jewish and Islamic thought, they were all grappling with these issues.
The entry mentions Nicholas of Crese's idea of one religion and various rites, and Erasmus's humanist vision of religious unity based on a core set of essential beliefs, the adiaphora. These seem like early attempts to find common ground, to reduce religious conflict.
They were efforts to bridge divides by focusing on either underlying unity or shared essentials, while allowing for diversity in less important matters. But then the Reformation changed everything. Luther's emphasis on individual conscience based on Scripture, that challenged established authority and led to even more fragmentation. At the same time, figures like Sebastian Castellio emerged, directly attacking intolerance and defending freedom of conscience and reason.
The 17th century, that seems like a crucial period. Intense religious conflict and foundational theories of toleration being laid out by thinkers like Spinoza, Pierre Bayle, and John Locke. Spinoza, for example, he focused on justice and love as the true essence of religion. He argued for state regulation of outward religious practices to maintain order, but strongly defended individual freedom of thought.
Spinoza's separation of the ethical and spiritual core of religion from specific dogmas, his insistence that the state can't control the inner life of the mind, those were hugely important contributions to developing toleration as a philosophical principle.
And Bayle, he seems to have systematically refuted the arguments for forcing people to convert to a particular religion, including those made by Augustine. His concept of a natural light of practical reason, which reveals universal moral truths, provided a powerful framework against intolerance.
Bayle's argument that basic moral principles like respect and reciprocity should override specific religious dogmas when it comes to toleration, that was groundbreaking. And he also pointed out that religious truth is different, epistemologically speaking. It's based on faith and trust, not just pure reason. That further weakened the case for forced belief.
Locke, in his famous letter concerning toleration, he made that classic distinction between the state's duty to protect civil interests and the individual's right to care of the soul. He argued for a God-given right to freely practice religion. But, the entry notes, even Locke's toleration had limits. He excluded groups he thought threatened civil society, like Catholics in the political context of his time, and atheists.
Even with those limitations, Locke's work was incredibly influential on liberal thought and the separation of church and state. The 18th century saw the further development of the secular state and the formal recognition of religious liberty, especially with the American and French revolutions.
Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, Kant, they all engaged with toleration, sometimes focusing on its role in political stability, sometimes emphasizing individual conscience and reason in belief. Lessing's Parable of the Rings and Nathan the Wise, that's a powerful image of religious pluralism, the idea that the real worth of different faiths is in their ethical consequences.
Lessing's work perfectly captures the Enlightenment spirit when it comes to toleration. Peaceful coexistence, mutual respect between different religions based on shared human values.
Then, in the 19th century, you have John Stuart Mill. In On Liberty, he broadened the scope of toleration. It wasn't just about religion anymore, it included all sorts of diversity. He advocated for tolerating a wide range of opinions and experiments of living. He gave us the harm principle as a key criterion for limiting interference with individual liberty, and he argued that tolerating even false opinions is useful for finding truth. Plus, there's the intrinsic value of letting individuals develop themselves by freely choosing their own way of life.
Mill's work is a bridge to a more modern, expansive understanding of toleration. It's vital for individual autonomy, intellectual progress, and a flourishing society, especially as societies become more and more diverse.
So fast forward to today. How do we justify toleration in the modern world? The entry points out that while many historical arguments are still relevant, the respect conception seems particularly important in our increasingly multicultural societies.
It is, and there are different ways to justify this respect conception. One common approach is the ethical liberal justification, drawing on neo-Lockean ideas. It stresses the importance of respecting individual autonomy, the ability of each person to choose their own idea of the good life.
But the entry raises a challenge to this view. It suggests that maybe it implicitly favors a particular kind of good life, one where autonomously chosen values are seen as better, which is debatable. And it points out that these justifications could lead to a kind of perfectionist state that interferes to try and promote individual autonomy.
Right. And responding to these worries, there's an alternative justification, often called neo-Bayesian. It focuses on the discursive principle of justification. Basically, any rule that's going to bind everyone in a society has to be acceptable to everyone as free and equal people. This approach emphasizes a fundamental right to justification.
And within this framework, there's a distinction between ethical or religious reasons for objecting to a belief or practice, which others who don't share those commitments might reasonably reject, and morally justifiable reasons for rejection, which are the ones that violate this principle of reciprocal justification.
That distinction, the entry argues, is a way to deal with both the paradox of moral tolerance and the paradox of drawing the limits. It suggests that we should generally tolerate beliefs and practices as long as they don't violate that fundamental principle of reciprocal justification, as long as they don't try to undermine the very basis of peaceful and respectful coexistence.
But the entry doesn't stop there. It raises some critical questions about this principle of justification itself. Can it really be neutral and impartial in practice? Is the line between faith-based beliefs and rational knowledge always so clear? It also mentions John Rawls, who tried to develop a tolerant yet substantive liberal theory of justice.
Those are some of the big ongoing questions in political philosophy today. How do we find a solid justification for toleration that's both principled and sensitive to all the different worldviews in modern societies? How do we do that without falling into relativism, where all beliefs are equally valid, or without imposing our own philosophical or metaphysical views?
Finally, the entry talks about the politics of toleration. It stresses that actually applying toleration, it always depends on the context, on the specific conflicts and norms within a society. And that's especially true in today's increasingly pluralistic world. We see this in debates about accommodating religious practices, gender equality, the legacy of past injustices, and how to allow different ways of life to flourish.
For sure. Current issues like free speech, hate speech, the impact of digital communication, they're all tangled up with the complex politics of toleration. The entry highlights the critical theory perspective too, which reminds us that power dynamics are at play in both denying and granting toleration. Power influences what's considered acceptable and what gets pushed to the margins.
It's a constant back and forth, isn't it? Negotiating, contesting. A healthy politics of toleration, it means disagreement, criticism, setting limits, but all within this framework of mutual respect. It's about striving for a more just and emancipatory political life.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, constantly evolving. It's not some static endpoint.
So as we wrap up this deep dive with you, our philosophy-minded listener, we've gone through a lot, unpacked the many sides of toleration, explored its inherent paradoxes, looked at how it's been understood and practiced throughout history, and examined the ongoing debates about justifying it and applying it in our complex world.
The big challenge, as we've seen, is finding that balance. Holding on to our own judgments about what's right and wrong, while also finding strong reasons to allow things we might disagree with to exist within ethical limits, of course.
And with that, here's a final thought for you to ponder. In a world that's becoming increasingly diverse, and with all the challenges of polarization we're facing, what do you see as the biggest philosophical hurdles to defining and maintaining the limits of toleration? What framework will be both principled and effective? Think about the different conceptions of toleration we've discussed. Which one resonates with you the most? What are its strengths? And what are its weaknesses, especially when it comes to navigating the complexities of pluralism and identity in today's world? It's a question that demands ongoing philosophical exploration, one that will deeply shape how we live together in the future.